Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tan, for your nice introduction. And it is my honor to represent my co-authors on this paper, Zhao Xi, Zhang Youlin, and Chen Hongling 老师. And I'm going to talk about public and private safety net for low-income families in Taipei and Shanghai. And in this presentation, I will talk about the subjective experiences of low-income families in interacting with the public safety net and the consideration behind their thoughts. So there will be some implications on social policies, but not so directly examining the policy provision itself. And actually currently I'm working with Dr. Irene Ng from the US and other scholars in Japan and Korea and Hong Kong that we're trying to examine the adequacy coverage of social safety nets in these 6 East Asian regions. And hopefully in the future, if there will be opportunity, I can share more about that with Dr. Tan and other people who are interested. So through this research, the research question we want to ask is how do low-income families interact with contemporary welfare mixes to cope with poverty? And we focus on their subjective lived experiences and also the factors that affect their considerations in drawing support from various sectors. And we have to start with the broader background to talk about, okay, what do we presume from these 2 places? So based on the literature on East Asian welfare models from various scholars, starting from the 1980s, they started to try to question, okay, what is the feature of social policies in East Asia? And they come to several points or synthesis. Basically, they mostly agree on that family play a central role as a welfare providers, and then the Confucius culture also play a strong role that shape citizens' idea about that they have duties to the country rather than entitlement and rights from the country. And also the filial piety tradition in Confucius culture also reinforce the idea that family should be the central welfare provider. Government, relatively speaking, play a smaller role in providing welfare, and this is manifested in their welfare expenditure level in East Asian societies. The welfare expenditure level is generally much lower than OECD countries. And the role of social policy is to pursue economic growth rather than social policy being the end by itself. So these are the commonly agreed East Asian social welfare features. But then the question is that in the past 2 decades, we have witnessed much transformation happen in East Asia in terms of demographic transition, the political transformation, social transformation. And this resulted in different strands of especially private safety net and public safety net. And do our original conception about how social welfare is like in East Asia still hold? So comparative research in a way that I can offer insight into like in alternative society, whether their welfare system is effective in meeting the welfare needs. And in this study, we particularly focus on Shanghai and Taipei. They have similar ethnic roots, cultural origin, and in terms of economic development progress is arguably similar. And in both places, we have low poverty rates in the official poverty rate as defined by absolute poverty in the relative in the respective places are around 2%. This is due to their very stringent definition of poverty rate. Doesn't mean that like they have real like the experience of poverty is rare. And in terms of the welfare environments in these 2 places, in Taiwan, from the past 2 decades, it has been argued to transform from a developmental universalist as described by Ian Holliday to a liberal welfare regime. So that this provision is becoming more institutionalized, and then the welfare or social policy role is becoming more central than subordinated to economic growth objective. And whereas in mainland China, in the past decades, it's transformed from a collective socialist regime to a productive regime. And then I'm going to talk about the framework and literature review. So in this study, we take a perspective of welfare mix in understanding low-income families' experiences. So a welfare mix is a combined and interdependent way in which welfare is produced and allocated between various sectors. So here we focus on state, market, informal sector, and voluntary sector. State is the government, market is the enterprises, and other market service provider. Informal can be family, friends, and what else, like colleagues, neighbors, whereas voluntary sectors can be like NGOs who provide professional services, and also like charitable and philanthropy organizations. And prior literature in talking about welfare mix generally talked about the relationship between sectors, the trade-off of a policy design, like what's the focus on the state, especially in the social care setting, how much social care provision should come from the state, how much should come from the market, how much should come from the families, and then also whether the role between sectors are substitutional or complementary. When it becomes substitutional, then sometimes we question whether the design is actually crowding out the original strength in non-state actors. And overall speaking, globally, the welfare mix trend in the past two decades has been marked by the partial retreat of the state. The retrenchment happened in many countries around the world, and then there has been increased prominence of markets and families in producing welfare. So the approaches have been shifting the responsibility to the state. And existing studies really take into account the full array of welfare providers. So in the four sectors we talked about, a lot of times, a lot of studies only focus on selective sector, the trade-off between the state and voluntary sector, or the state and informal sector. So few studies that take into account of different sectors and its relationships. And then most studies take a macro perspective to think about, like, when we construct a welfare system, like what's from a designer's point of view, like how should we allocate the responsibility? But few have taken the micro perspective to be based on the low-income families' perspective to understand their experiences in interacting with various sectors. So in this presentation, even though that the goal is to look at various sectors, but based on time constraint, I will focus on state and informal sector for brevity. But feel free to inquire into other sectors finding if you're interested. Overall, when we think about the government sectors in Taiwan and China in general, although in both places the public expenditure on social welfare is low, but in Taiwan it's relatively higher, and then the adequacy in their social assistance benefit level is higher in Taiwan. And during the past 2 decades, Taiwan's welfare system is more stabilized, whereas in China is in rapid expansion, has manifested in many different provisions and programs that happened in the past 2 decades. And then one interesting feature of the state sector in Taiwan and China is that the role of local bureaucrats. In other literature talking about local bureaucrats, they generally focus on the welfare officers, those who process the application. But in Taiwan, in Taipei and Shanghai, the one interesting feature is the residence committee, the Juwei in Shanghai, and the village chiefs in Taiwan, Lijiang in Taiwan. They interact with family directly. And then in Taiwan, the case of Lijiang, they are not the village chief, they are not the the people who review or receive the application of social assistance, but in a way, they actually help with the family and then also provide information to the family. So here, the local bureaucrats serve as a complementary role with the state, that they provide low-income family with information related to job, to welfare programs, and the voluntary NGO. I think this is an actor that is really seen in other like poverty-related literature in helping low-income families. In terms of the role of informal sectors, the filial norms are strong in China and Taiwan. If we have to compare, Taiwan has a higher level of filial piety, and also the intergenerational co-resident rate in Taiwan is higher. And in that is the trend we observe. But in the social assistance system, based on the eligibility rule, Taiwan is also taking a more stringent role, like expecting the family to support low-income family to a larger extent. So then if their family has any non-resident family member have any asset, for example, you have a rich grandpa has a land, then you may not qualify for social assistance unless you take necessary measure to dissect the relationship in order to qualify for social assistance. So the family still has are expected to provide welfare in two places. And then also it's ingrained in their institutional setting, where the state mandates parents to care for their children, for adult children to care for their parents, and then there are also tax benefits associated with this type of family support. So overall, the perspective we take are the welfare mix perspective. And also when we think about the support the low-income families seek from others, we think we include in our consideration the instrumental support, the emotional support, and also informational support. So instrumental support can be monetary subsidies. It could also be like your neighbors giving you some food, and it could be services provided by NGOs. So these are the range of instrumental support that we take into account. And we hope to contribute to existing literature to think about welfare mix from a micro perspective, to think about families' consideration in reaching out support to different sectors, which is different from existing literature that mostly focusing on from the design level, how do we allocate responsibility of different sectors. And then finding can also contribute to evaluating existing social protection system from a welfare system perspective, beyond only the state sector, but also other configuration that help low-income families. And hopefully we can propose a conceptual model in explaining low-income families their strategy in reaching out to support. What are their considerations? And then in some way we have a new contribution related to the role of local bureaucrats. So we recruited our samples through various sources. Basically, we try to look for families who were persistent in poverty and those who exited poverty in the past two decades, like that's starting from early 2000s until now. And we used the local poverty definition. And we focus on families in their 40s and 50s. And we recruit respondents from varying organizations, because we want to understand their help-seeking strategy. So then that way, the goal is to diversify the sources of respondents. So we both recruited from more governmental sources, but also NGO sources. And we coded the data in vivo, and we have at least 2 coders who have gone through the transcripts, coding the data, and discussed our understanding of the transcripts are consistent. So overall, we interviewed 18 respondents in Taipei and 16 respondents in Shanghai. And majority of them are female, and a lot of them have unemployed experiences. And many of them are not in the married relationships, especially in Taipei, because when you are in a married status, you are less likely to meet the poverty definition. As expected, family bonds still remain strong in many low-income families. That when they seek help, they think about family. About half of the respondents from which we interviewed, they mentioned that family is important when they encounter financial hardship. So some respondents in Shanghai mentioned that relationship between non-family members can be very fragile, especially when you come to asking for money, for help. No matter how good the relationship was, it may not be good enough. But when it is your own sibling, it doesn't matter, right? If your siblings see you in difficulty, they will come and ask how the situation is, even if you say nothing. So this is not to negate. Actually, the family members still play an important role in many families, like help-seeking network. But we do observe that there are also a great proportion of family that we talk to, they do not seek help from family members. They prefer not to seek help from family members. So sometimes friends, colleagues, and neighbors complement with or substitute the supportive role of family members. So it is not uncommon that we receive quote like this. So here, this respondent in Taiwan mentioned that like when she encountered financial difficulty, she will consider friends first because family members may be scared of you. And then their attitude is so different when you have money and when you don't have money. But for friends, if you have needs, you ask for their help. If they can have money, they will say yes. If they don't, then they will say no. And your friends will not avoid you or something just because they say they do or do not have the money to lend it to you. And so this is not uncommon that sometimes like the family that we talk to, they will prefer people who near them than family members. We also observe, like from the Western literature, they start to talk about because those low-income families, a lot of times they have low social capital, so they establish weak tie and they capitalize on the weak tie for meeting survival needs. So here we do see some examples of weak ties in providing support. For instance, like neighbors, they may, if you break your leg and then your neighbors may send like fish soup to you. We observe many landlords, they give them lower than market rate rent because they know that you have difficulty. So this type of goods are helping families to get by. We even encounter that like people, because we know that the social relationship is not so distant in Taipei or Shanghai. So we also hear cases where people just walk on the street, run into a stranger, talked about that, oh, I don't have a job now, and then the stranger try to introduce opportunities he or she knows. So we also see, observe some instances of weak ties playing a role. And in terms of the role of the state sectors, social assistance is still an essential support for family. In this, for this family in Taiwan, this mother mentioned that having qualified as a low-income household has saved me, because with the status, no matter it's in Taipei or Shanghai, the welfare status is not only about getting the subsidy, but it's the all the benefit associated with the status, that you can get education subsidy, you can get medical subsidy, you can get free tickets to popular stars concert, you will have holiday subsidies. And sometimes you even have many in-kind support. If you have the status, you have it. If you don't, then you lose every associated benefits. But then in both places, we also observe that they complain about the amount of the subsidies. That, for instance, for this family, they only receive $600 for Dibao. And then she said that you still need to buy a school bag, and then to buy food and milk is $600 enough at all. And then the familiarization of social assistance policy is observed to be stronger in Taipei, where like one of our respondents has a classic quote. He said that Taiwan is the most difficult place to apply for, to be qualified as a low-income household in the world. And he said, it's not what I said. I have learned it from the TV.
Could you please turn the slides?
Huh?
Could you please turn the slides? I think the slide just freeze.
Oh, okay. Okay, which page are you at right now?
We are in the qualitative interview page, the method page.
Qualitative interview page. Okay, too bad. Sorry that you missed the scene. Okay, anyway, if you were here, okay, then about Taipei and Shanghai, this is the distribution of our sample, 18 and 16. We talked about the strong tie from family, but then also some preferences for friends and colleagues and neighbors who are non-family members. And then the social assistance aspect is essential but inadequate. And then we started to talk about the familiarization of social policies in Taipei. Because in this case, because like his father, this respondent is a male, his father received a sum of pension, but then that pension actually went to his aunt because the aunt paid for the social contribution for his father. So for this resources that they never touch, because of that income record, they cannot qualify for social assistance. So they had to go with much paperwork in order to make sure that they can qualify for it. So many people complain about like how stringent it is, and then many have to like dissect the household boundary in different way in order to qualify. Whereas in Shanghai, the definition of family member is not as strict. Many Dibao family we talk to, they live with their parents, but then their parents' resources are not counted together, and then their parents' pension play a strong role in supporting their lives. We also observe a growing conception to view welfare provision as rights in both in Taipei and Shanghai. So here, interestingly, that let me know again if the slide is not moving, okay? Okay, so the government has the right to determine whether to grant welfare to me and I'm not expecting more than what I deserve. I should receive every single penny that I'm qualified for from the government. So like, because the government has the review process, if they are qualified for it, then she finds herself deserving. And then we asked about like, how do you view the idea of welfare in a general term, not specifically toward this person. And then the respondent mentioned that the Dibao is what the government, is a person's right. It is what the government should give me, and I can enjoy my rights. And then, do you view it as something that you owe to the country or the society? The interviewer asked, and the respondent mentioned that what does this person owe? It is what the country got us into. We used to have a good life. I think this respondent was referring to before the economic reform in mainland China. So the collective society was good in their mind. So then they view that the consequences of their suffering is a result of the government's doing. And then in another case, this is a daughter in her 40s who have depression and have difficulty sustaining a job. So she's living on Dibao. And she brought her mother to the interview. And then when they started to talk about the worry that, okay, if in the future the mother can no longer take care of this 40-year-old daughter, where should her life be, and how can they survive? And then the mother say, the country has to take care of you, right? They won't let this daughter go without care. So they have a strong sense that the government will be there. And when we think about the interaction between the decision between their consideration between choosing state or choosing like informal network for help, we observe that families are looking at social assistance as a route to achieve self-reliance. This is slightly different from the Western literature's idea of self-reliance. So here, like this respondent mentioned that I will not go for my informal network. I will go for public resources. Because the resources come from the society, I will repay in the future. And then public welfare is not something that involves relationship or entanglement, which are what private resources have. They don't want to have that relationship with others that I feel like I owe someone money. So that is what public resources can offer. And in another case, that this respondent also mentioned that I will prioritize my help seeking based on public resources because the environment is not good. When you need a large sum of money, it is difficult for your network to come up with that amount of money. And another interesting phenomenon we observe is the paradox of self-reliance. In the Western literature, when we talk about self-sufficiency or self-reliance, it's majorly referring to independence from welfare and relying on labor market income as the primary source of income. It is defined as self-reliance. And whereas from many interviewees that we talk to, they view self-reliance as independent from families. And then the government actually become an avenue for families to be independent from the government welfare become an avenue for family to be independent from their informal networks. So in this particular interview in Shanghai, that we excerpt different quotes from in the same interview, but just in different segments of the conversation. Earlier, this person mentioned that like she will never borrow money from others. That I don't want to borrow money from others, so I don't have that burden on me. Never, I will not rely on others. And then when asking about their experiences in applying for DBAO, and she mentioned that I had poor health, I had no money to buy things. This is what a typical person could think of. It's just normal to apply for welfare. It is acceptable to get government subsidies. And then another part of the interview, when we asked about like, who would you go to when you encounter hardship? And she responded that I would go for government and will not think about families. It's okay for relatives to help once or twice because of compassion. If more, then people will ignore you or look down on you. If I borrow money from others, I cannot sleep. This is a heavy burden. We never borrow money. So it shows that we observe this is unexpected, that we are not expecting this trend, but then we observe this in like many incidences in our interview. In another case in Taiwan, this lady had a spinal cord injury, and she's in her 40s, and then her father is the primary person who managed the finance in the family. So, so we asked about, okay, when your father faced problem, would he look for his brother? Because previously she mentioned about her father having a good relationship with the brother, or will he go to the government? And then the respondent said that my father will go to the government. He will only find his brother if he completely run out of potential solution. Her father know very well that everyone's living is not easy. He will also value to save face. But how about the feeling of applying for welfare? Does it concern her father? And she said, he's fine. He's fine with getting help from government, but he's more uncomfortable about getting help from the informal sector. So the need for public safety net to substitute the burden of soliciting help from the informal sector is observed from our interviews. Okay, and I will try to speed out a bit about local bureaucrats. We found that local bureaucrats serve as an important supplementary role in assisting families. In many cases, that when they first have the incidents of financial hardship, like for example, a husband died, or like someone like someone lose the job or having an injury and become incapable of working, they a lot of times like the village chief in Taipei or the resident committee, Juwei, they showed up and then they can try to help with these families, and they provide information on welfare programs, job information, and all sorts of different types of support. And also they usually have a small budget that they can allocate to these emergent needs. Interestingly, now in Taipei, we observed that like for government, like for those people on low-income assistance, on DSHO, they actually, they don't know about many of the NGO resources, because actually that's a way for the public sector to promote self-reliance. So they don't want to give too much welfare information to families, whereas the local bureaucrats actually does not have this mandate. In some way, they are wealth of resources. So a lot of times they provide unrestrained resources for families, and then to link families to different sector of information and support. And even though local bureaucrats are a promising source that link families to different sources of resources, but then we also find that relationship also determine the access to information and resources. In the case in Taipei, when this respondent, this lady, just when her husband just passed away, the village chief already submit a social assistance application on her behalf, because that the village chief was a close friend to my husband. And then we also saw, like, in the cases that when a low-income family is not receiving support from the village chief, a lot of times because they don't have a private relationship, but when they have, there are a wealth of resources that can flow in. And then in Shanghai, we also received a quote like this. This is that like the relationship determine the amount of resources, and then low-income families sometimes actively like try to maintain or build a relationship with this local bureaucrats. So in this case, like in the resident committee, the committee there are so many residents in it. So so how can you make sure that the resident committee will think of you when they have resources? So the way is that she will take her son to volunteer event to make sure that they are showing faces, contributing to the resident committee event, and almost like and I suspect coming to this interview is also a way for her to show that when you call me, I will show up. And then that way, like her son will get the scholarship. And then that way, the resident committee people will trust you, think that you are deserving to help. So then it's also there from the family's end, they are also trying to maintain the relationship or constructing the relationship. Okay, so these are the findings from the government and informal sector. And then I will quickly summarize factors that come into play when family try to think about whether I look for help from the government or the informal sectors. And many families we talk to, when they have a sustained need, like I'm always short on cash each month by this much, then usually they won't go for friends or the family, because they know that I can ask for money once, but then I cannot ask for money every month. And then, so when there's transitory nature, sometimes they just look for nearby resources. And also the magnitude of needs. If you want a great sum of money, usually your network cannot afford that much. But if you just want a small sum, then sometimes they just ask the colleague to give them a few thousand NTD, like that. They also factor in the cost of application for welfare, the cost of applying, of borrowing money from people they know. Does it involve interest? do they, and then there's a respondent who mentioned that I will not borrow money from others because I don't want to lend people money in the future because you know that it will get into that entanglement. And some may calculate that whether there's a need for repayment later. Their value about whether welfare is their right also may affect like whether they will look for public support. The relationship proximity, sometimes like when the relationship is really good, like when they were young, the aunt always buy you snacks, and then when you grow up, you feel like that relationship can be something to be capitalized. But then in the case that, like for example, a lot of cases that we talked about, these mothers, like they have brothers, but because of the sister-in-law, that they don't feel, they are deterred from looking for help from their brothers, because the sister-in-law will try to manage the finance and safeguard, and self-esteem and faith is another consideration. So based on these factors, I think the takeaway for me is that the assumption that low-income families have family support readily available and easily accessible is a naive assumption. Like there are more complexity that go into their struggles in putting together the sources of support to meet their needs. And then trying to put these factors into a conceptual framework. In the usual help-seeking model, the earlier phase would be to recognize there's a problem, and later on then you will actually decide to seek help. And later on, when you decide to seek help, then there are different sources of possibilities. So then you need to select which support resource to go to. So here we can contribute more to the process of support selection, and then utilizing borrowing framework from other help-seeking literature in the health domain or in the domestic violence and drug use abuse domain. Then we can try to fit the factors into the model in trying to more clearly communicate the difficulty and complexity in seeking out support from low-income family. From a low-income family's perspective. Okay, so quickly about similarity and differences. We observed that even though that in the traditional East Asian welfare model narrative, we talked about, okay, citizens have the duties rather than rights, but we see the growing conception of rights as the welfare expanded and the culture and norm may change in these societies. And some family can only provide weak support. So we observe that non-family informal ties are providing stronger support. And we see that government assistance can be a way for low-income families to achieve self-reliance. They view it as a pathway or avenue to achieve self-reliance. And we see the promise of local bureaucrats in identifying families in need and providing support to them. Yet sometimes it's relational based, and then reform would be ideal. Like in Taiwan, there are debates about the reform of the system to make it more institutionalized. And in both places, we observe that like where the help is available, whether the government assistance is available, this information is not something that they know from their daily living. It's general. A lot of them, they have a spontaneous or casual encounter with someone, and they found out, oh, actually there is government support that they can try to apply to. So we find that the welfare information is not something that everyone has knowledge of, but then it really depends on your luck that you find out from your daughter's and your daughter's friends' parents, or your colleague, or like these are, or sometimes when you go to village chief and then you find out about this, it's not something that every citizen has the information about. And some differences we observe involve that the familiarization of eligibility rules is stronger in Taipei, and then And then in Shanghai, actually, we still observe a stronger sense of family support, whereas in Taipei, this sense is not as sticky. Last slide. So the weakening role of family support that we observe in Taipei and Shanghai questions the fundamental assumption in policy making that we should not, a lot of policy discourse would go like this, that we should not weaken the family support function. But then actually does family is family an option for low resource family? This is a question. And in tackling the information disconnect when families are in need, their source of information a lot of time is pretty sporadic, based on luck. And then local bureaucrats may hold a promising role since they are already ingrained in like people's life in Taiwan and China. So this can be an institution that can help tackle the information disconnect. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia, for the very incisive, very interesting presentation. Okay, we now have about, we're supposed to stop at 1, but I think we can extend it to even up to 1:15. So I would say that we have half an hour for Q&A. Please identify yourself and keep your questions short so that we can allow more people to ask questions.
Okay.
So I'll just open it to the house. Please go ahead. Any question, anyone?
Sorry, I asked question in the chat. Are we meant to do that?
Okay, you can do that, but I think if you want to ask directly also is all right for me.
Okay. So can I ask, thank you, Julia, for that insightful presentation. Earlier, you presented the findings in the literature that the family plays a central role to help low-income families. Would you say after your study that this is still the case, considering the fact that nuclear family structure is now the norm in most cities in Asia? We have rising divorce rates and there's increasing individualism.
So I will say that it is possible, but it really depends on luck from the low-income family. If they have happen to have a wealthy family member or more well-off family member, then they generally can draw support. But then we should not expect that people's whether they can have a basic lack of living, it depends on their luck to born into what type of family. So I would say that yes, family support exists, but then it's not guaranteed in many cases that I talk to.
Yeah, I think essentially what it means is that the family is not a reliable basis, right, for providing financial support. And actually elsewhere I've written about this also to say that maybe people just don't like obligation nowadays, right? They don't like to be obligated. But whereas for friends, they know that when they help, right, you know, it is not expected, but when you give, people are appreciative. But when it comes to obligations, people are not so appreciative, right? Because it's expected for you to do anyway, right?
Yeah, and then like in many like cases we talk to, they draw support from the childless family member, especially their sibling who did not give birth to a child, and they do not feel like they are burdening them. But then not everyone can have this sort of support. Yeah, so I think from the policy making point of view, the assumption is rather strong in expecting people to have family support.
Yeah, I think usually when you have family members who are single, right, not married, and there's a lot of expectation on them, right, to be caregiver and also to be giving more financial support. Okay, any other questions, please?
Hi, Answer. This is Irene.
Irene, yes, hi.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, Irene.
Yeah, I have two observations. One, your point about the information disconnect is very interesting, and I think maybe Singapore is more similar to Western society in the sense that formal assistance from the government is given through a welfare officer. And it feels to me like in your case, what you call information disconnect might also be a network thing. So it's a social support, like you said, that you know the village chief, that you know that person and talk to that person. But in Singapore, we don't have this kind of, opportunity, because the welfare officer is just someone in the office that is removed from your usual networks. And then related to my second observation, then in Singapore, I think we still have a much larger stigma to getting welfare assistance. So I think it's just really amazing to me that in your study that your respondents see welfare as a right. I think that is far from the experience in Singapore. Yeah, and so then this is the difference. But I think one similarity that I see, I did a study on a program that relieved debt for low-income households. We measured social support using the Rubin social network scale, which asked them how many people you see regularly, you talk to, or you get help from, right? And in general, our low-income respondents with huge debts, they are rather isolated. Yeah, but after the debt relief, it was very interesting that people started to connect more with their friends. So I think it resonates with your findings, like that somehow being in financial need removes you, then you actually need more support, but then you isolate yourself because you don't want to be an obligation to others. And we found that the effect is larger for males.
Yeah, they have the same face, right? I think.
Yes, I think so. I mean, we don't have the quality study to explain why, but yeah.
Yeah, and then in the interviews that we did, a lot of times the guy would say, okay, my wife will deal with this. All these things I don't want to touch, especially applying for welfare. But then it's okay, he doesn't want to show the face, but eventually if the family get the welfare, he's happy. And about the stigma observation that you share, I think I will not say that there is no stigma that experienced by them, but I think stigma is a type of cost that they factor into consideration, and balancing different considerations. My understanding is that what they share about that welfare as right is the result of their conciliation of different factors. So in the end, even though there's stigma, but actually it's my right. So then it kind of rationalize and make them feel more okay about receiving government support. That's my understanding, because actually my colleague Chen Hongpeng, she is focusing on welfare using the data, using the qualitative data to dig the stigma aspect of it, and then to look at poverty stigma, welfare stigma, and how people rationalize and cope with stigma. So I wouldn't say that it doesn't exist at all, but just interestingly, I think people find a way to cope with it from some families that we talk to. And then quickly about the information disconnect. Yeah, so actually the welfare officer in Taipei, sometimes when a family do not qualify for low-income assistance, then the welfare officer actually tell them that, okay, you can go to X NGO, they provide monthly financial subsidy. So it's kind of an informal source of information that they receive. But then for low income, for those who qualify for welfare, I asked them, when you access welfare, did you consider X NGO, because it's famous in Taiwan, they provide sustained resources for low-income family when they do not meet the eligibility criteria. And then she said she never heard about it. So it seems like those who are in the system, they only know about the system. Not for everyone, but the system will not provide you with additional information. You can still grab help from XYZ. But whereas when you're not qualified, it really depends on luck, like who you encounter, to know what resources are available out there.
Any other questions?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Questions from others? Feel free. Oh, Vincent is around. Vincent. Oh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Hi, Julia.
Hi,
I think my question is sort of quite basic. Trying to figure something out here, and I found it interesting. You said in Taipei is one of the most difficult countries in the world to apply for welfare. But at the same time, if you look at the percentages, right, 14% in Taipei versus 10% in Shanghai, actually the amount of the percentage of welfare given in Taipei is higher
It
as
is
that in Shanghai. So is it maybe the difficulty in getting welfare in Taiwan, right, is more of perception than reality?
Well, actually, the 14 and 10% are welfare expenditure as proportion of total welfare, and then the actual rate of receiving public assistance is 1%.
Oh, I see.
It's very low.
And then, but in China, is what's number?
It's about 2 to 3% from my understanding. But in Taiwan, because of its low coverage rate, in 2011, we had a reform where we included like a middle to low income families. It's trying to capture some people slightly above. And then in the end, the recipient rate become 2% or something, but still quite low. So, so that's why if I, in this study, we also cover about the role of NGO. So we really need additional support beyond the public who only cover the very bottom.
Well, actually, if I have a...
are you saying that the criteria are very stringent in Taiwan?
Yes.
Why it disqualify a lot of people, right?
Yeah, and then mostly due to asset and savings. So they expect you to exhaust all your savings before you can access public assistance. Okay.
Vincent?
No, I was just saying that actually sort of one hypothesis I have is that in societies where the safety nets are very strong, then the reliance on networks will be less, because people will say the government is giving a lot of help and I don't need to rely on family to get by. So that would have been my hypothesis. But based on your presentation, I realized that actually it's much more complex. You know, sometimes it's not so neat. So I learned about that, that many factors, local bureaucrats, and even the distinction between what is a privilege and a right, I think would explain some of these. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot to do with saving face, yeah.
Yeah.
And also the fact that, you know, for family members, right, you're going to interact with family members over the long term, and therefore, you know, you got to make sure that you maintain your dignity, right?
Yes.
Whereas for government, it could be a one-off thing.
That's true.
Other questions, please?
Yeah, can I ask a question about the difference between Shanghai and Taipei, considering that they have different political system? Could you explain how that impact the kind of welfare system they have, and what are the differences of the welfare system in those two cities?
Well, welfare, you're referring more to the government aspect or the including
the
NGO?
Overall welfare system that they have. You know, like in Singapore, it's very much based on self-help. Like the government will help you for as long as you try very hard to get a job. You know what I mean? Like what kind of principle governs the two cities, considering that they have two different political systems?
Okay, so actually, in terms of the social assistance system, I see more commonality than differences under the political regime. Well, but the similarity is that they have to meet the income threshold, and then but then in Shanghai, like who is counted as family is looser than in Taipei, and then one key differences I would say is the process to qualify for welfare in Taipei is mostly based on your financial profile, whereas in Shanghai, or everywhere in mainland China, there is a public announcement process where someone will go to your home to do inspection, and then also they will post your application on the community board for everyone to see, to verify. So for your neighbors, if they know your lifestyle should not qualify for Dibao, then they can tell the resident community that this person should not qualify for it. So there is a public announcement process, which is attaching more stigma to Shanghai, but then the relationships still come into play here. So basically, based on requirement, all family applying for public assistance should be publicly announced. But then from our, because we recruit family from many agencies of different street offices, and then we find the practice is inconsistently enforced. And especially when you have a good relationship with the resident communities, sometimes you can get away from this process, and then you can easily get your status recertified. And in China, there has been I think a trend try to reduce the number of people on welfare. So then they're talking about it's getting harder to be on welfare roll than before. And then the recertification period is shorter than before. Like every 6 months, they whatever income you have into the system, they will automatically check your eligibility. So it's more evidence-based in the review process than before, but then there's still maneuver room for the local official to determine welfare eligibility. Yeah, so I think I see more similarity, but in enforcement, we see that there's some principle, it may be like more distinct in the mainland China context.
Okay, can we allow for next question? I think Ji-Yun, you want to ask your question orally, if you want to. It's something about what low-income family have low-income relatives, right? Something like that.
Yeah, right. I think, yeah, thank you for giving me a chance. Actually, I think caregiving is really related to the pillar initiative, but I think the supporting the poor is a different story, I think, for me, because sometimes a family as a unit, the poor individuals in the poor families, so they also related to the other family members in the poor status. So I think how can he make a productive discussion about connecting from the pillar piety and supporting the poor families.
So here I am not stressing on filial piety in particular, because I am more focusing on the present rather than the intergenerational expectation or caring duties. So I think I mentioned about filial piety is just to use that as a proxy or indicator to describe the family norm in the respective context. So I agree with you that caregiving is different from the literature associated with caregiving is not equivalent to low-income families' experience, given that many low-income families, they may not have a strong family network to begin with. Does that answer your question, or feel free to let me know if I haven't.
Yeah, I think we still have time for questions. I thought somebody else was going to ask the question, and we sort of missed you. Anyone? Go ahead, please.
Can I ask a question about the choice of sample?
Oh yes, please.
Participants, how do you come to determine those born between 1966 to 76?
Yes. It's actually very arbitrary. Okay, so this project was originally designed to be a mixed method project, so it's kind of confined by the quantitative survey, what's the age range that they incorporated, and we had respondents from 1930 something to 1976. And at the time, to think about the comparative and qualitative study, there are major events that happen in mainland China that may, like for example, the Cultural Revolution that happened, and then that disrupt many people's educational experiences during their school-going years. So then I was trying to escape this cohort. So then that way the experiences of two places respondents from two places will be more comparable. Yeah, and also I think when it comes to recruitment, this study kind of also tell me about the complexity in collecting data in the mainland Chinese context, because poverty is becoming a sensitive topic there. Because poverty is, alleviating poverty is a strong emphasis from the government. They want to like monitor the type of informations are getting out there regarding their progress. So having reliable collaborators on the ground will really help, because it really requires some network in order to get into to get access to the families.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Latching on to that, Julia, so the quanti survey data, do you have data on how much people you borrow money from the informal networks versus how many will go to the government? Because this small study they express that they would rather go to government, but you know, in the larger study, what is the reality? Yeah.
That is a good comparison. I haven't compared the monetary value that they receive from government and informal sector. But then the downside to the quantitative data is that it does have welfare information, and then they only collect information regarding how much your parents give you, how much you give your parents, but not specifically about the amount from your other relatives or friends. They ask about whether you seek help from like friends, neighbors, but then they did not mention about the amount, so they make it more limited for that data source to comparatively look at people's help-seeking pattern.
I guess even whether they borrow money might be helpful, yeah. But if the question is whether they seek help, then that's too general.
Yeah, that's right. Any other question for anyone else? I think we have time for maybe one or two more.
Can I ask one more?
Hey, maybe let others have a chance first. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, if not, we'll let BB ask a question, and then then we'll wrap up after that. Yeah.
Okay, mine's a very straightforward question. So earlier, Julia, you mentioned that the rate of poverty as defined in Shanghai is fairly low because of the way they define low-income families. Can you have you done the study of how Taipei and Shanghai define low-income family relative to the international standard for low poverty?
Okay, thank you for the question. I would say both places, their official poverty line is not linked to the international definition. So what I mean is that the commonly used OECD standard is like, for example, 50 or 60% of the median income, which is a relative poverty line. And Hong Kong defines poverty line based on this international standard. And whereas in Taipei, there is no official poverty line. But what we have is that they use the minimum living standard in the place. It's also almost similar to the social assistance line as the line to draw where the poverty line is, which is not linked to other international definition, whereas in mainland China, they have an official poverty line for rural side. So to convert the rural poverty line to urban one, there's no official one for urban one. So then they take a factor. I forgot the precise number. It could be like 1.6 times the rural poverty line as the urban line. I need to check about it. So then actually these are estimates and they are not very, and then the rural poverty line in China is defined by actually the World Bank's $1.25 a day, but they adjust the poverty line. The last time they adjusted was 2011, as far as I recall. And then they use that to determine the rural line and then take a fraction of that to become a urban line, but then that is not the official definition. That's what researchers have tried to do in order to capture poverty rate.
I think international comparison is always quite tough, right? Because we also need local conditions and requirements, right? Okay, I think with that, I think we thank Dr. Julia Wang for the interesting and very insightful presentation. I think personally, I learned a lot from you. I mean, I like your what you say about welfare mix. I like what you say about all these things about, you know, the family, right? We always thought that the family can be a reliable source of support, but it turned out to be not so. And whether there's filial piety or not, right? In practice, do they really practice their what they believe in, right? In terms of the values. Yeah, I think there's a lot of food for thought. There are more questions we'd like to ask, I'm sure, and more that we can do like in this area. So thank you very much, Julia. And thank you one and all for attending this seminar.
Thank you
I
for
think
the.
yeah. So
thank
yeah, that's